Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for another SEPA-sponsored webinar. Today, I have the distinguished privilege to introduce Dr. Linda Pescatello, who will be speaking about the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. What's new? Before we get started, I just want to talk about some of the normal procedures with these webinars. The webinars are recorded. I will convert them to an MP4 file and provide access to all the attendees so they can view the webinar at a later date as well. I will also provide a CEU certificate and the PDFs of the slide at the end of the webinar. Also, if you do have questions during the webinar, I will ask that you type them out and Dr. Pescatello will answer them at the end of the webinar. All right, so today I would like to introduce Dr. Pescatello. She is currently a fellow of ACSM and the American Heart Association and is a distinguished professor in kinesiology at the University of Connecticut. Her research focuses on exercise prescription to optimize health benefits, particularly among adults with hypertension and overweight and obesity, and on genetic and clinical detriments of the response of health-related phenotypes to exercise. Dr. Pescatello is an American College of Sports Medicine Citation Award recipient, was the associate editor of ACSM's Guidelines for Exercise Testing Prescription, the 8th edition, was the senior editor of ACSM's Guidelines for Exercise Testing and Prescription, the 9th edition, and she served as an expert panel and writing team member on an update for the ACSM's exercise prescription, or my apologies, pre-participation health screening recommendations published in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. She was recently appointed to serve as a member of the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. She has authored over 150 manuscripts, 4 books, 16 book chapters, and has numerous University of Connecticut, American Heart Association, National Dairy Council, NIH, and the United States Department of Agricultural funded grants. She has also served as ACSM's Vice President of Basic Science and Allied Health, and is a member of the ACSM's Board of Trustees and Administrative Council. Now, today, the webinar will be on the American Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. And in the write-up, it will provide science-based advice on how physical activity can promote health and reduce the risk of chronic disease for children and adults alike. The guidelines serve as a benchmark and primary authoritative voice for the federal government for evidence-based guidance on physical activity, fitness, and health for Americans, and provides a foundation for federal recommendations and education for physical activity programs, including the Healthy People Objectives and Presidential Youth Fitness Program. Dr. Pescatello's webinar will overview the purpose, change, and process of the writing of the guidelines that were released earlier this year. In addition, she will highlight what's new in the guidelines. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Pescatello.
Thank you, Dr. Werner, for your nice introduction. And as you've stated, the title of our webinar today is the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, with a focus on what's new. But more specifically, if you're looking at the slide that's currently showing, you'll see a document entitled the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee Scientific Report. And it is that report that will be the focus of our discussions during the webinar. And I would like to call out the Clinical Exercise Physiology Association for their invitation and opportunity to represent the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. during this webinar. We appreciate and actually would ask all attendees to keep spreading the word. So Dr. Werner has already begun to answer a bit of this, but before I do start, I would like to just go over with you what are the physical activity guidelines for Americans. And as he has stated, they provide the newest and latest scientific-based advice on how physical activity can promote health and reduce the risk of chronic disease for children and adults alike. They are the benchmark and a primary authoritative voice of the federal government for the evidence-based guidelines that will be coming out hopefully at the end of this year on physical activity, fitness, and health for Americans. And I'll be talking more about this process during the webinar in a bit. You can see they inform our physical activity recommendations and physical activity education programs, such as Healthy People 2020, that shortly will become Healthy People 2030. And then you can see the enormous reach they have. The federal government, the policymakers, research scientists, healthcare and exercise professionals, teachers, students, and the American consumer. And again, people listening in on this webinar. And I would just like to say it is due to the extent of their reach and the impact they have in the United States, but not only the United States, internationally, that it was such an honor to be selected to be one of the 17 members of the advisory committee. Many of the scientific report and other things I will be talking about during the webinar are available from this website and this link. And I learned prior to giving the webinar that the American College of Sports Medicine will post it on their continuing education website. I will also be sending them a PDF of the presentation so that you will have access to these links and others that I will show. So what I plan to cover today is initially talk to you about the charge that was given to the advisory committee, then overview the process, which I think you'll find quite interesting, as I did. And then the largest portion of the webinar will be a discussion of what's new in the scientific report. And then lastly, we will conclude with your questions and answers. And Dr. Werner will be the person selecting your questions that I will ultimately answer at the end of the presentation. So what was our charge? Well, the 2008, and it was the first edition of the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, really served as the foundation. And it was an excellent document in terms of organizing what we would ultimately review and grade in the 2018 scientific report. So each committee member reviewed this document and they looked at the topics and determined, do they need to be updated or not? If they didn't need to be updated, they wouldn't be included in the 2018 report. And then because of the emergence of new evidence, there were things that weren't covered in the 2018 report that the committee felt very strongly should be addressed in 2018. And I'll talk to you more about those topics in a moment. Again, because of the huge expansion of knowledge on physical activity and health in the last decade, we decided that our primary focus would be on systematic reviews and meta-analysis to most efficiently review and grade this literature. Also, one of the biggest considerations we had in terms of the topics we chose is what was the public health need? And then we were to prepare and submit to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services a scientific report of the technical recommendations that would ultimately inform the development of the second edition of the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. And this process we completed within the 2 years of the chartered time we had. And one thing I would like to mention in viewing this slide is that this scientific review was purposely kept independent for the policy recommendations. So when we submitted the report to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, honestly, we're not sure what the policy recommendations will be made when the second edition is released, hopefully at the end of this year. So now let's talk about the process. This figure depicts the process nicely. We began by being chartered by the Physical Activity Committee Act, which ensured that our scientific review of the literature was independent from the policy recommendations and also would be available in an open and public health manner. And you can see that act was issued on June 1, 2016. Thereafter, over the span of really probably a year and a half, we had 5 meetings at the NIH in July and October of 2016 and March, July, and October of 2017, in which we publicly displayed our review of the literature and our grading of the evidence. That was made available for public comment. In addition, during the entire process that extended beyond these dates of these public meetings and meetings at the NIH, we had weekly conference calls. And depending on your role on the committee, some people were on 2, some 3 subcommittees. There were also a leadership council. You could have anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 weekly conference calls a week. And I was on 2 subcommittees, and therefore we had 2 hourly weekly conference calls almost every week. Then you can see in February, or on February 18th of 2018, we submitted the report, and it was subsequently published to the Department of Health and Human Services. And they are now working on developing the policy document that, again, hopefully will be released in late 2018, and if not, early in 2019, when the dissemination begins to take place. The leadership from the federal government, the lead was the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, but we also had members from the CDC, the National Institute of Health, and the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition working with us as we developed the report. And at this time, I would like to acknowledge the 17 members of the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, and in particular, highlight the co-chairs who were Dr. Ken Powell and Dr. Abby King. And the thing I will say is, as the process ensued, the members of the committee deepened their feelings and respect for one another, because it became very evident with all the time we were spending with the trips to the NIH, but also the considerable amount of work each of us were doing, that we were motivated by one of our concluding statements, and that we truly believed physical activity was our best buy for the health of our country. So in terms of the methodology, it was a very vigorous review process, adhering to the highest standards so that we could ensure our reviews were transparent, minimized bias, and adhered to the highest quality. And you can see some of the standards that we did follow during our systematic review process. And in total, we examined 38 questions related to physical activity and a range of health outcomes, and also addressed 104 sub-questions relating to those specific factors. And each member on the committee really did get down and dirty, where we did conduct our own systematic reviews in dual with other members of the committee, and also the firm that was hired to assist us with the systematic review. And we screened and selected the evidence to review, which was quite large and had to be narrowed down. We extracted, coded, and synthesized the data. And then in our various chapters, we described and graded the evidence to answer each of these questions that had to be presented and approved at one of those 5 public health meetings, or public meetings I mentioned earlier. So again, our major focus, let's review, and I will highlight what I think is most relevant to this audience, what's new in that scientific report, and then I'll point you in other directions as well. And I think the best way to start this discussion is to review with you the table of contents. The report is quite large. It's actually 779 pages. And there is an executive summary right at the beginning, that's 16 pages, that summarizes and overviews both the major findings as well as our recommended directions for future research. So I would suggest you start there. And then this part F is the scientific base. And there were 11 chapters addressing the topics you see here. Any that I've highlighted in blue are new and were not covered in the 2008 report. And that includes sedentary behavior, brain health. Youth was covered in the 2008 report, but not at these younger ages, 3 to less than 6 years of age. And again, there is a new chapter on promoting a regular physical activity. And in total, this portion of the document is 600 pages, and it contains an enormous amount of detail, but I really would suggest if you have a special interest in any of these topics, you take the time to read the chapter. And then what the committee had to do is they had to put the scientific base in meaningful format for the government to draft the policy statement. So another chapter I definitely would recommend you reading is Part D, Integrating the Evidence. That is about 65 pages in length. And then, being a fundamentalist at heart, I always like to take a look at the fundamental principles and definitions. And this is a short chapter, which I would also recommend you reading. And let's start here. The definition of physical activity was broadened in this report because of the feeling of the committee members that physical activity is embedded in everything we do and how we lead our daily lives. So it does not require or imply any specific aspect or quality of movement, and it encompasses all types, intensities, and domains of physical activity. Now, typically, we refer to moderate to vigorous intensity forms of physical activity. But in this document, it was expanded, and more specifically, when referring to physical activity, these descriptors should be mentioned. Sedentary behavior, light, moderate, vigorous, or moderate to vigorous intensity should be used when talking about any specific range of intensities. And because we're referring to the specific range of intensities now, and exercise is a subset of physical activity, the same should be done for exercise. So it is preferable now to specify the intensity when discussing or describing exercise. And then the other term I wanted to cover, because it is a new focus of the 2018 report, is sedentary behavior. And sedentary behavior is any waking behavior characterized by an energy expenditure of 1.5 or fewer METs while sitting, reclining, or lying. So that 1.5 or fewer METs is key. And examples include most office work, such as we're doing with this webinar, driving a car, and sitting while watching television would be examples of sedentary behavior. And I'd now like to pause and give you a bit of a quiz, which illustrates why the committee felt so strongly that we had to address sedentary behavior in the report. So your quiz question is, how many waking hours per day does the average American spend in sedentary behavior? Is it 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, or 12 hours? Well, the answer, based upon work by Diaz and colleagues, is 12 hours. And there's some members on the committee that felt it was actually more like 14 hours per day of sedentary behavior, which equates to 75 to 90% of the time we spend in a day is spent in sedentary behavior. So it's clearly become a significant public health issue. So now what I'd like to walk you through are key parts of the report and highlight the new evidence that I think would be most relevant to this audience. And again, we'll start with Part A, the executive summary of the major findings, which is a short chapter of 16 pages. Again, we concluded that physical activity is a best buy for public health. It reduces the risk of a large number of diseases and conditions, and I'll share with you a table in the document that's excellent in this regard. Again, there was a focus on brain health, and this was one of our major findings, that physically active individuals sleep better, feel better, and function better mentally and physically. It was great for me to see attention being drawn to the immediate health benefits of physical activity, which we call acute exercise. And you will see these effects with brain health. You also see them with blood pressure, which has been a major focus of my research, as well as glucose and insulin sensitivity. And the benefits of physical activity can be achieved in a variety of ways, and we'll talk about this in a moment. And then efforts to promote physical activity can be effective, which is that new chapter at the end on strategies to promote physical activity. So now we're going to move to the chapter, again, which we wrote specifically for the government and the people that will be working on the policy. It's Part D, integrating the evidence. And one of the questions I would like to walk you through is, what does current scientific evidence reveal about the relationship between moderate to physical activity and the risk of developing a variety of chronic diseases and other health conditions? I'm not going to read you through every line of this table, but you can see in this section of the report, there is a table D-1, and it is entitled Physical Activity Related Health Benefits for the General Population and Selected Populations Documented by the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. And you see here there's various population segments, and what is listed here is when we found moderate to strong evidence for the effect of physical activity on the health-related benefit. Now, anything that has been bolded is new evidence that was not existent in the 2008 report. Those that are not bolded are grades of evidence that did exist in the 2008 report. And for example, I told you children, this younger age segment, 3 to less than 6 years of age, a new finding in the 2018 report is improved bone health and weight status. Again, moderate to strong evidence to make this statement. You can see for older adults, new things we found is a reduced incidence of fall-related injuries and improved physical function. This was a working group, not a specific subcommittee on women who are pregnant or postpartum. And you can see there were several new findings that are included in the report about women who are pregnant and postpartum. Here you see, again, other segments of our population and chronic diseases and health conditions. And anything bolded is a new finding relating to a chapter or topic in the 2018 report. And for example, when you look at weight status, which was discussed in Chapter 5, these were statements made in the 2008 report. And it was the feeling of the committee there wasn't a whole lot to add about weight loss. So instead, our focus and our review of the literature was based on excessive weight gain. And you can see that those who are physically active have a reduced risk of excessive weight gain. Here you see for other diseases, pre-existing medical conditions, and whoops, sorry about that. And these are all new findings in the report, and some of these were also new populations. But again, you can see for brain health and dementia, there was improved cognition, and some conditions with impaired executive function, you see listed here, there was also improved cognition. Let's move on to the next question. In that, what does the evidence indicate about the public health target range or dose of moderate to vigorous physical activity that is likely to provide the health benefits listed in the table I just showed you? Well, the good news I have for you is the recommendation doesn't change. You see the maximum health benefits achieved at 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous, or some combination of the two, and that would be per week. But I'd like to share with you now a figure that shows you some of the new ways of thinking in the recommendations that will be made. And that comes actually moving on to this question, that what do we do about below or above that target range, which is 150 of moderate or 75 of vigorous, or some combination of the two. And here is a graph where you see the relative risk of all-cause mortality. This could also be cardiovascular disease and diabetes. On the x-axis, you see the minutes per week of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. And then there is another axis over here, which represents these gray bars, and that's the percentage of adults achieving this amount per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. One thing to highlight is, first of all, there's no threshold of benefit. The minute you become more physically active, you accrue benefits. And in fact, the steepest slope is right here, going from no physical activity to some physical activity. Here you see the current range of 150 to 300 minutes per week. And you notice that, yes, the curve does level off here. Now, don't be alarmed. It looks as though, but this is a bit of an artifact, that there could be some lessening of the benefit. But why we would not put a lot of faith in this latter part of the curve is, as you can see, there are so few people engaging in this amount of physical activity per week. And then the other point about this curve is when you look over to the percentage of adults meeting the various recommendations, that you can see, which is highlighted in this box, that half the population not meeting this amount would clearly benefit by moving to doing something. So the next question, what does the current evidence indicate about the importance of the intensity, duration, and frequency of moderate to vigorous physical activity that comprise the weekly target volume of physical activity? And there are some very important things for me to highlight here for you that are a new way of thinking. For public health purposes, and remember this was our charge, total volume is more important than any specific intensity. Also, total volume of accumulated MVPA is a more important determinant of health benefits than the duration of the episodes. And indeed, there's new research that we integrated in our report that says any duration contributes to the total volume and determines benefit. Therefore, we concluded that these newer findings do not support any longer the previous recommendation that only bouts of 10 or more minutes provide health benefits. Any bout of any duration provides benefits. So there is no lower threshold, as I kind of showed you on that previous curve. Another new finding relates to the frequency, and again, this is based on new evidence that the committee weighted, that the total volume of MVPA is more important than the number of days per week on which individuals perform physical activity. However, when you're thinking about acute exercise effects, that if in particular a health outcome is improved immediately after one session of exercise, for those health outcomes, you may want to exercise more frequently during the week. However, again, new evidence that was integrated in the report suggests that individuals who accumulate all or most of their weekly PA on 1 or 2 days per week, such as the weekend, experience significant reductions in all-cause and cardiovascular mortality that's equal to individuals who accumulate a equivalent total volume, and that's the key, on 3 or more days per week. So in essence, this is saying goodbye to the weekend warrior, and that if time is only available for 1 to 2 days and it's on the weekend, doing it on those days, considering that there would be an equivalent total volume, is better than not doing it at all. And now we're going to move on to sedentary behavior. As you'll see in a moment, there is evidence indicating that the volume of MVPA affects the risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality associated with sedentary behavior. So there's interaction between the time we spent in MVPA and the time we spend being sedentary. And to illustrate that interaction, a new figure in the 2018 report, which I think is great, we've called this the heat map. And what the heat map depicts is the relationship among moderate to vigorous physical activity, sitting time, and all-cause mortality. On the y-axis, as you move up, there's more sitting time. On this axis, as you move to the right, you're engaging in more moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if you're engaging in the most sitting time, you have the highest risk of all-cause mortality, which is depicted in red. As you become more physically active, you can see that those who are most physically active have the least risk of all-cause mortality and are most healthy. So now let's focus on this person who has a high amount of sitting. You can see that this person can negate, lessen, and possibly eliminate their risk of all-cause mortality if they engage in this amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, which amounts to 40 to 45 minutes daily of vigorous or 80 to 90 minutes of moderate. Now, when you look at, again, the axis relating to sitting time, even someone that doesn't sit very much, if they engage in no moderate to vigorous physical activity, they're at increased risk. However, by simply engaging in lighter intensity forms of physical activity, and this is an important point throughout the document, they begin to lessen their risk. And the person, again, at I would say less risk is always the person that is more physically active. And again, this is called the heat map. So what is the evidence about chronic conditions? Well, there's a variety of benefits. In lieu of time, again, I'm not going to read through these tables. I just want you to be aware they're here. But you can see, again, very common forms of cancer, looking at the reduced risk of all-cause mortality, cancer-specific mortality, and a developing recurrence. Again, there's evidence for risk of all-cause mortality reduction and cancer-specific mortality reduction. For other chronic diseases in this table and integrating the evidence, and again, they're very common, you can see we looked at the evidence for the risk of mortality, quality of life, physical function, progression of disease, and cognition. And one I would like to highlight here is osteoarthritis, in that we found there is no evidence of progression of osteoarthritis up to 10,000 steps a day. And again, you see other chronic diseases and the health benefits related to risk of mortality, quality of life, physical function, progression of disease, and cognition. And you can see for many of these on this slide, we did find improvements in physical function. Although, as you can see, there were many risk reductions. The literature was not existent, so we couldn't address, or we just stated there was insufficient evidence. So this is chapter 11, which may be especially of interest to some of you on the webinar. What interventions are effective for promoting regular physical activity prevention? Well, there's different levels of impact, looking at the level, whether it be individual, community, environment and policy, information and communication technology levels. And once again, there's a very nice table in that integrating the evidence report, table 2-4, that addresses the various levels of promotion, the type of intervention. And when we talk about strength of evidence here, it's not the strength of the effect size, it is the strength of an existent relationship. So these ratings are slightly different than what I showed you in the other tables, but you can see across a variety of levels and types of interventions, there is moderate to strong evidence for the strength of the relationship. And one of particular interest may be information and communication technologies. And again, you can see the rating here for the strength of the relationship. And last, community-based level interventions would have a moderate strength of evidence of a relationship. So in terms of where we go, there is a detailed chapter in the report near the end, Part G, needs for future research. However, what I will do for you is highlight and overview those areas where we acknowledge there's a need for future research in the executive summary. The first, and not surprising, is we need to know more about the independent and interactive effects of physical activity and sedentary behavior on health outcomes throughout the lifespan. That role of light intensity physical activity. In terms of strategies, again, this relates to chapter 11 on ways to promote physical activity in multiple settings across the age span. Dose response relationships. We did the best we could, but there's clearly health outcomes for which we could not comment on. So clearly an area of need for further investigation. And surprisingly, throughout the report, in all the questions, we were very limited in what we could say about the effect modifiers of sex and race and ethnicity. So clearly more research needs to be done looking at these effect modifiers. And then it's already happening in the next 10 years. There will be the development of instrumentation and data collection systems, which we did not really address, but clearly would be addressed in the 3rd edition of the physical activity guidelines. So I will now conclude by acknowledging the colleagues and the 17 members of the Physical Activity Advisory Committee. Again, it was just quite an opportunity to work with these people. And then I would like to acknowledge the leads from the federal government. Again, the head coming from the Department of Health and Human Services that you see here. And that will conclude, again, the discussion of the scientific report. And now what I would like to do is open up our webinar to any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Piscatello. Right now, if anyone in the audience has a question, I would recommend they type out their questions so that we can address it. So Dr. Piscatello, we have our first question from Lori. Her question reads, we currently have to quantify met minutes and take only the 10 minutes or more to simplify computation. The 10 minutes or more is no longer advised. Do you have any suggestions on capturing met minutes without logging each individual activity and long computation?
Yeah, our report, let me clarify that if we're talking about the same thing. When I said that 10-minute threshold, that wasn't met minutes, that was 10 minutes. And if you look at the previous set of guidelines, in terms of duration of the bout, it was stated you needed to do the lower threshold of 10 minutes to receive any benefit. What we are now saying in the 2018 report is that threshold is no longer discussed. Any duration in terms of minutes, and again, whether it be light, moderate, or vigorous, confers health benefit. So to say that we wouldn't be logging things throughout the day, I mean, we don't necessarily talk about that in the report, except that we say they can be accumulated in any duration and really any intensity.
Currently, there are no other questions. Again, if you do have a burning question, we strongly recommend that you type it in now before we close this webinar. Again, wanted to take this minute to let everyone know that I will be sending everyone a link to the video recording along with the CEU certificate and a PDF copy of the slides. All right, we have another question here, Dr. Piscatello. You mentioned an interaction between sedentary behavior and the moderate to vigorous physical activity. Is there a recommendation for the amount of daily sedentary hours to reduce risk?
Well, just hold on. I'm going to go to the heat map to answer that question, because I really think this is an important document to focus on in terms of the recommendations that are going to be made at the end of the year. So is there a specific recommendation? As you saw, an area of continued research is looking at these interactions. And the best the committee could do is, this is stated in the report, that if you're sitting a lot, to again get over into that green zone of reducing your risk of all-cause mortality, this is the ballpark figure. In terms of a specific recommendation per se, we didn't feel there was enough evidence to make it. So that would probably ensue in the next decade, when the third edition of the guidelines would be coming out. One thing I should mention to everyone on the webinar, though, and I didn't do this in my talk, is that it's slated for February, but there will be a whole issue of med science and sport devoted to our findings in the scientific report. There'll be separate chapters and manuscripts related to each of the chapters. So please be on the lookout for that issue of MSSE.
All right, I think that concludes our questions. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I really hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I hope to see you next time. Again, Dr. Pescatello, thank you very much for your time. And I'd
You're
like to
welcome.
conclude. All right, take care, everyone.